It was 2 a.m., the kind of hour where the world sleeps and every sound feels louder than it should. My phone rang, breaking the silence, and when I answered, her voice hit me like a thunderstorm. Desperate, trembling, almost pleading. She said their son needed $22,000 immediately, and that if I didn't act, everything would fall apart. I felt the weight of her words press down on me. My heart raced, my mind spun, but deep inside, I knew this was a test, not just of money, but of respect, trust, and boundaries. I could feel the manipulation hiding behind the panic, the expectation that I would drop everything, bend, and obey. And then, in that quiet moment, I did something I never imagined I could. I hung up the phone, not out of anger, not out of hate, but out of clarity. Out of the realization that silence can sometimes speak louder than words, and that standing firm could be the most powerful act of all. It was a night so quiet that the world itself seemed to be holding its breath. Outside, the occasional rustle of leaves whispered in the wind, and the distant hum of traffic felt almost like a lullaby. I had just settled into the rare comfort of stillness, the kind that comes only when you think everything in life has paused for a moment. My mind wandered through trivial memories, lingering on fragments of laughter from the past, moments of calm I had longed for. The night was mine, and yet, somehow, I felt an undercurrent of tension I could not name, a faint tremor of anticipation that made me uneasy even as I sank deeper into the solitude of my living room. And then, as if shattering the delicate bubble of peace, my phone rang. The shrill sound sliced through the darkness like a jagged knife, startling me, sending a chill down my spine. The clock glared to a.m., a time meant for silence, for dreams, for things that existed only in the quiet corners of our minds, not for reality to hit with the weight of urgency. I answered with a tentative voice, a whisper that seemed too small for the storm I was about to face. On the other end, her voice emerged, trembling, desperate, urgent. The tone was one I had heard before, but it had never felt this raw, teased, piercing. She spoke quickly, almost frantically, each word tumbling into the next, like stones sliding down a steep hill. Their son, she said, was in trouble. Urgent, life-threatening trouble, and he needed $22,000 immediately. The numbers alone made my heart lurch, a cold realization that this was no casual request, no minor inconvenience she expected me to manage. She pleaded, almost weeping, each word coated with an invisible pressure, the kind that made every syllable a weight pressing against my chest. The desperation in her voice was intoxicating in its intensity, commanding attention, bending the room around me with its insistence. I sat there, motionless, my grip tightening around the phone. My mind raced, trying to untangle the threads of what I was hearing. There was urgency, yes, but also something else. An undercurrent of expectation, a calculated tension, as if this chaos had been crafted to manipulate me into immediate compliance. It was impossible not to feel the storm in her voice, the fear, the panic, the insistence that this money must be produced and delivered now, or the consequences would be catastrophic. The entire situation felt surreal. It was one thing to hear of a sudden emergency, another to have it hurled at you in the dead of night, when every instinct screams caution, when every thought is clouded by the weight of half-sleep and fear. I could hear the tremors in her breathing, the hitch of a sob she fought to suppress, and I understood instantly that she expected me to surrender, to act without hesitation, to bend under the weight of her need. And for a moment, part of me wanted to. Part of me felt that urge, the human pull towards compassion, the instinct to protect, to provide, to calm the storm raging in another's voice. But deep inside, a quieter, sterner voice spoke, warning me, urging me to pause, to consider, to see past the desperation to the truth hidden behind it. I'd learned before that panic could be a tool, that fear could be wielded as a weapon. And tonight, the pattern was clear. This was not merely a son in need. This was a test, an invisible line drawn sharply in the darkness, challenging me to cross it, demanding submission through emotional pressure. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain calm as her words continued. Relentless, each one a plea, each one a demand, masked as urgency. She painted vivid images of disaster, of consequences so severe they seemed almost cinematic in their extremity. Every sentence was a push, every pause, a weight, pressing on the fragile equilibrium of my composure. I felt a tension knotting in my stomach, a mix of fear, frustration, and disbelief. She didn't give me time to breathe, to think, to question. There was only the torrent of need, the expectation of compliance, the assumption that I would act without hesitation. And then, in that surreal, almost dreamlike moment, I realized something profound. The power in this call was not in the crisis itself, nor in the amount of money demanded, but in the way it had been presented. A test of will, a challenge to my sense of self, a silent judgment waiting to be delivered based on my reaction. This realization brought a strange clarity amidst the chaos, a stillness within the storm. I understood that my response would matter more than the act itself, that the way I chose to engage or disengage would define the trajectory of what was unfolding. It took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding myself in the reality of my own strength. I did not panic, did not plead, did not yell. I listened, weighing each word, parsing the tone, dissecting the urgency, reading the unspoken motives behind the desperation. And in that moment, I made a choice, not out of cruelty, but out of understanding. I would not be swept away by the emotional tempests she had unleashed. I would remain anchored, silent yet firm, a presence unmoved by manipulation. Time seemed to stretch, elongating each second into an eternity. Her words continued, but they began to lose their grip on me. The storm rattling through the phone no longer dictated my heartbeat. The midnight breakdown, as it was unfolding, had lost its dominance. I felt a strange empowerment, the kind that comes not from confrontation, not from victory over another, but from the quiet realization that one's own boundaries are inviolable. That self-respect can stand even in the face of fear, panic, and coercion. The call ended the way it began, abruptly, with my own hand pressing the button, cutting the line of desperation in its tracks. Silence returned, heavy yet comforting. The world outside remained still, the faint hum of the distant city resuming its gentle rhythm, as if acknowledging that the balance of power had shifted, that the quiet strength of one person had withstood the chaos of another. The night, once broken, now held a different kind of tension, one not of fear, but of resolution, a quiet knowledge that some storms are best faced with calm, and that sometimes the loudest voice is the one that speaks in silence, even in those hours after. As sleep eluded me and thoughts replayed the encounter in vivid detail, I felt the lingering echo of what had happened. The midnight breakdown, with all its urgency and panic, had become a lesson, a demonstration of how desperation can be wielded and how boundaries, once recognized and upheld, create a form of power that cannot be shaken. And as the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, I understood that the night, though fraught with tension, had revealed something deeper. The strength to remain unmoved, the wisdom to recognize manipulation, and the courage to choose silence as a weapon of clarity and self. The moment hung between us, thick and suffocating, heavier than the night itself. The words she had spoken earlier still clung to the air, vibrating like a trapped wind in a bottle, demanding attention, demanding action, demanding obedience. Her voice had been desperate, trembling with urgency, filled with fear, with expectation. And yet, in that instant, I realized something that made my pulse steady and my mind sharpen. This was not just about money, not about crisis, not about her son alone. It was about control, about power, about testing the limits of what I would endure. And in that moment, I understood that how I responded would define the night, the relationship, and perhaps even the person I was becoming in the quiet spaces of my own life. I listened to the tremor in her voice, the breathless cadence, the frantic insistence that this money be given immediately. Each word was like a spark on dry tinder, threatening to ignite panic in anyone who allowed themselves to feel it fully. I felt a pull instinctively, the human instinct to act, to comfort, to appease, to make the fear go away. Part of me wanted to rise to the occasion, to prove that I was dependable, that I would do whatever it took for the sake of her desperation. But another part, a quieter, steadier part, spoke from deep within. The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried a gravity that none of the shouting, crying, or begging on the other end could match. And then, with a deliberate motion that felt more symbolic than necessary, I pressed the button and hung up. The silence that followed was almost deafening. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of decision, a void filled with the echo of my own resolve. Her expectations, her frantic cries, her assumption of compliance, all of it dissipated into the void I had created by refusing to respond as she wished. The act of hanging up was more than a simple termination of a call. It was a boundary drawn in the sand, a statement of intent, a refusal to be moved by external panic. Even as the adrenaline faded from my veins, the weight of the action settled over me like a cloak. I could feel her panic lingering in my mind, an almost physical sensation of expectation unmet, a tugging at the edges of my conscience that had been deliberately left unyielded. The echo of refusal was not meant to wound, but to illuminate, to demonstrate that strength does not always roar, and courage does not always clash. As the minutes passed, I imagined the reactions on her end. Disbelief, frustration, perhaps even anger. But those were not my burden to carry. The line I had drawn was mine alone, invisible but unbreakable, defined not by confrontation but by restraint. In that stillness, I felt the weight of my own integrity, the satisfaction of having stood firm where others might have crumbled, the silent triumph of self-possession over coercion. It was a lesson in restraint, in understanding, in quiet power that could not be measured by noise or spectacle. There was also a strange intimacy in the act of refusal, a closeness, born not of collaboration but of recognition. I recognized her desperation for what it was, raw, human, fraught with emotion. And I also recognized my own limits, my own boundaries, my own need to assert calm in the face of chaos. The act of saying no, of refusing to be swept away by the torrent of panic, was itself a connection, a communication deeper than any conversation could have achieved. It was a dialogue of values, a conversation of unspoken understanding that some crises cannot be solved by submission, that some storms require the quiet strength of unyielding resolve. In the hours that followed, I replayed the call in my mind, dissecting every word, every pause, every inflection. The urgency that had seemed so overpowering at the moment now appeared as a pattern, as a predictable rhythm designed to compel compliance. And in seeing it clearly, I felt a surge of clarity, a sense of power that came not from confrontation, but from awareness. The refusal that had echoed through the night was not an act of cruelty, but an act of preservation, of self-respect, of dignity, of the recognition that sometimes the loudest voice is the one that chooses not to speak, the one that hangs up, the one that allows silence to convey the strength that words cannot. I did not expect gratitude, nor did I seek approval. There was no applause, no acknowledgement, no external validation for the act. Its significance was entirely internal, contained within the quiet chambers of my own understanding. The echo of my refusal resonated not in her immediate reaction, but in the awareness that I had preserved my own integrity, that I had maintained clarity where panic sought to cloud judgment, that I had asserted a quiet, unshakable strength in a moment designed to erode it. And as the night wore on, the silence that had followed the call became almost companionable. It was a reminder of the choices I had made, of the boundaries I had set, of the quiet power that exists when one refuses to be moved by manipulation. The echo of refusal lingered not as a threat or a punishment, but as a testament, a living proof that sometimes the most profound actions are those that occur without spectacle, that sometimes the loudest statement is the one made in quiet, deliberate resolve. Even now, in reflection, I can feel the reverberation of that decision, the weight of it, and the relief it brought. It was a night that could have been filled with chaos, with panic, with regret, with fear. Instead, it became a night of clarity, A night of self-possession, a night where the echo of refusal carved its lesson into the silent hours. A lesson that no amount of pleading, no matter how desperate, could erase. After the call ended, an eerie stillness settled in the room, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The echo of her voice lingered in my mind, not like a memory, but as a living presence, insistent and heavy. A reminder of the demand she had placed on me in the dead of night. There was anger there, but it was subtle, more like a pulse beneath the skin than a storm to be unleashed. There was also sorrow, a strange ache that was neither fully mine nor fully hers, but something that existed in the shadow between us. In the quiet aftermath, I realized that what had happened was not just a test of money, or trust, or patience. It was a test of the heart, of boundaries, and of the power that comes from restraint. I had expected confrontation, perhaps even relief through argument, but instead, I had chosen silence, and it felt heavier than any words could have been. The silence was not empty. It was dense with meaning, filled with every unspoken thought, every suppressed emotion, every word that I had chosen not to say. I could feel it pressing around me, shaping the contours of the room, filling every corner with its quiet intensity. Her expectations had been clear, but in refusing to meet them, I had created a new space, one that was unclaimed, one that belonged entirely to me, and in that space my mind began to wander through the complexities of love, trust, and the quiet violence that often hides behind desperation. Love, I realized, could be a subtle form of imprisonment when wielded incorrectly. It could be a demand, a weapon, a silent hand pressing down with the weight of expectation. And yet, love could also be freeing, when paired with boundaries, clarity, and self-respect. I thought about the way she had sounded on the phone, how every syllable carried urgency, how every pause carried guilt, and how every expectation carried the weight of manipulation. There was a strange intimacy in that desperation, a closeness that came not from mutual understanding, but from the raw exposure of human need. I recognized it immediately, this desperate need for validation, for compliance, for control. And I understood with a clarity that made my chest tighten, that yielding in that moment would have been a betrayal of myself. To act out of fear, out of obligation, out of the desire to soothe her panic, would have been to surrender a piece of my own soul to the night. So I remained silent. I let the weight of her voice and the urgency of her demands pass through me without taking hold. I let the echo of her desperation resonate, not in action but in reflection, a mirror held up to her own intensity. In that silence, love itself froze, not in absence, not in coldness, but in clarity. I could feel it stretching, taut and unyielding, a bridge of understanding that could not be crossed by manipulation or panic. The act of hanging up, of refusing to be swayed, had not destroyed love, but it had transformed it into something quieter, stronger, and more deliberate. It was love tempered by restraint, sharpened by clarity, and held in the delicate balance of self-possession. The hours that followed were a study in contrasts. The night was still, almost oppressively so. But within that stillness, my mind was active, tracing every moment of the call, examining every intention behind her words, and understanding the subtle mechanisms of influence at play. I replayed the desperation, the urgency, the expectation of immediate compliance, and I realized that these things, while powerful, only held sway over those willing to surrender. I was not willing. My love, my care, my concern did not demand surrender. It demanded discernment. It demanded the quiet courage to remain steadfast when chaos tried to dictate my response. As the darkness outside deepened, I felt a strange paradox, a closeness to her that was born not of yielding, but of understanding, and a distance that was born not of rejection, but of preservation. Love had frozen in silence, and in that frozen space, I could see clearly the patterns that had been hidden in warmth, in comfort, in normalcy. The manipulation, subtle and insidious, had been made visible by the coldness of restraint. The expectations that had been so urgent, so demanding, now seemed fragile, almost transparent, easily held at bay by the quiet strength of deliberate refusal. It was in that frozen silence that I began to comprehend the deeper lesson of the night. Love, when mingled with desperation, can become a weapon, a tool wielded to compel action, to create guilt, to manipulate through fear. But love that is tempered by clarity and boundaries becomes a shield, a form of protection, a space where integrity and emotion can coexist without one overpowering the other. By refusing to act out of panic, by hanging up the phone, I had not abandoned love. I had preserved it, strengthened it, allowed it to exist in a form that demanded respect rather than submission. Even now, in reflection, I can feel the residual tension in my chest, the lingering echo of the night's confrontation, the strange beauty of silence that had carried so much meaning. Love had not been lost. It had been transformed. The frozen stillness was not empty, but full of understanding, full of boundaries, full of the quiet triumph that comes from standing firm in the face of emotional storms. Every heartbeat that followed, every breath I drew in the early hours of the morning, was a reminder that strength does not always roar, and that courage is often silent, hidden in the refusal to be swayed by urgency, desperation, or expectation. The quiet aftermath stretched on, the kind of silence that holds you, molds you, and teaches you. I sat alone with my thoughts, the phone now lifeless on the table, and I contemplated the subtle power of stillness. Each memory of her voice, each echo of her desperation, became a lesson, a study in the dynamics of influence, control, and love. I understood that in that frozen space, I had carved out a territory of my own, a place where clarity reigned and manipulation faltered. Love, once a tool wielded to compel, had become a mirror, reflecting not what I owed to her, but what I owed to myself. And so, the night continued, with all its quiet intensity, teaching lessons without speaking, shaping my understanding without shouting. The frozen love in silence was not a punishment, nor a withdrawal, nor a sign of indifference. It was an assertion of presence, a declaration of boundaries, a demonstration of the quiet strength that exists when one refuses to be consumed by the emotional storms of another. In that space I was whole, undiminished, and aware of the profound truth that sometimes the most powerful expressions of love are those that are measured, deliberate, and silent, allowing clarity and integrity to flourish where panic and desperation once ruled. Winning is the only language power truly understands. Principles, intentions, and explanations fade quickly, but outcomes remain. When a result is achieved, it reshapes perception, rewrites narratives, and silences opposition. Those who succeed are forgiven for methods that would be condemned in failure. Those who fail are judged harshly, even if their intentions were pure. This is not injustice. It is the natural logic of power. People do not evaluate actions in isolation. They evaluate them through results. Victory reframes behavior as necessary, intelligent, even admirable. Defeat reframes the same behavior as reckless or immoral. This is why survival depends not on moral purity, but on effectiveness. The world does not reward effort. It rewards success. The idea that the end justifies the means is often misunderstood. It does not imply recklessness or cruelty for its own sake. It implies responsibility. If one chooses a method, one must ensure it leads to success. Failure invalidates the choice. Power does not excuse incompetence, it punishes Italiano. Every action carries cost. The question is not whether a method is clean, but whether its cost is lower than its benefit. Those who refuse to act because no option is perfect often lose to those who accept imperfect choices. Inaction is also a method, and it carries consequences just as severe. Morality without results becomes performance. It signals virtue but produces no protection. Those who cling to moral appearance while losing ground eventually lose the ability to act at all. Power is not preserved by moral declarations, but by control over outcomes. Winning stabilizes systems. Chaos thrives in uncertainty. Once an outcome is secured, order follows. Rules, ethics, and norms are re-established after victory. Not before Italiano. History shows that peace is negotiated by winners, not by the defeated. This reality does not celebrate cruelty. It demands clarity. Those who understand it plan carefully. They choose methods proportional to the objective. Excessive force creates unnecessary enemies. Insufficient force invites challenge. Precision is wisdom. Fear of judgment often prevents decisive action. People hesitate because they imagine future criticism. Yet criticism exists regardless. The difference is whether one stands with power or without it when judgment arrives. Power absorbs criticism. Weakness amplifies it. The world forgives strength quickly. It questions weakness endlessly. This is why leaders are remembered not for how kind they were, but for whether they secured stability. Stability allows morality to function. Instability destroys it. Those who win control narrative. Narrative shapes memory. Memory shapes legitimacy. Once legitimacy is established, past actions are reframed as necessary steps. This is not deception. It is perception responding to outcome. The risk is not using harsh means. The risk is using them without discipline. Indiscriminate action erodes trust and invites retaliation. Strategic action minimizes exposure and maximizes effect. The successful understand restraint as well as force. Winning also creates deterrence. Future challenges diminish when strength is proven. One decisive victory often prevents many conflicts. Those who never assert power invite repeated testing. The burden of choosing means falls on those who seek responsibility. Comfort lies in moral absolutism. Power lies in contextual judgment. Context determines necessity. Necessity determines method. The end justifies the means only when the end is real, secured, and durable. Temporary wins achieved through chaos collapse quickly. True victory creates lasting control. Anything less is failure delayed. Those who reject this reality often believe morality will protect them. It will not. Morality must be protected by strength. Once strength is lost, morality becomes irrelevant. Winning is not about domination for its own sake. It is about survival, stability, and the ability to decide the future. Those who understand this act decisively, accept responsibility, and move forward without apology. The world does not ask how you tried. It asks whether you succeeded. Power is not a fantasy, and it is not a reward for good intentions. It is a reality shaped by understanding human nature, accepting the world as it is, and acting with clarity when others hesitate. Those who survive and rise are not the loudest, the kindest, or the most morally pure, but the most aware, disciplined, and strategic. The world does not bend to hope or fairness. It responds to strength, timing, and results. Those who learn when to blend in, when to strike, when to show mercy, and when to enforce boundaries gain control over their path. Leadership is not granted by approval. It is taken through responsibility and decisive action. To think like Machiavelli is not to abandon values, but to protect them with power. Kindness without strength is fragile. Morality without strategy is defenseless. Only when awareness guides action does stability become possible. In the end, history remembers outcomes, not excuses. Those who understand this do not wait for permission, sympathy, or perfect conditions. They act, they adapt, and they endure.